I was fortunate enough to have David as my immediate supervisor for the last 15 plus years of my career, and I worked 35.08 years for the department. I want that clarified. But David has worked in a variety of areas in the state. He has been involved in some of the most newsworthy events within the department, and I think he's an excellent choice for this. Now, I'm going to ask some basic questions, and I'm sure David's memories are going to take him off into different subjects. This is designed to be as educational as possible, and if he says something that prompts a question from you, let me know if you have a question, and we'll try to work in the question as soon as possible so that you don't forget what it was, or it can at least relate to what was being discussed recently. So if you got a question, raise your hand.
I hope there's something that we discussed today that will be of interest to you. I'm glad to see that there are as many as much of the young generation as I can see here interested in wildlife and wildlife management. I try not to say too much that scares you off. I try to be as positive as possible, and all I can say is the job it's turned out to be, much more than I thought it would ever be when I was an undergraduate and graduate student. So hopefully some of that will come out in the discussion.
We're going to get some background first. David, when and where were you born?
I am a refugee from California. Sometime in the mid to late 60s, I decided that the trend I saw in population growth and other things going on in California didn't interest me in the least. So from that point on, I started thinking about not living there for the rest of my life. And there's a lot in between, but eventually I ended up here in Alaska. Probably last time I was in California living was 1968, roughly. So I've been up here since '71.
What part of California were you in?
Central Coastal, Monterey Bay area, a place called Salinas. It's about 100 miles south of San Francisco. And it's an agriculture area. I grew up with, farms all around, and also not much of the urban influence, but some. And Southern California was foreign territory to me. I really didn't know much, still don't know much about that part of the state.
Who were your folks, and were they involved in wildlife?
No, not at all. My dad, I guess you could call him an Okie. I'm not making that up. His farming family, when he was a kid, 11 years old, they were blown out by the Depression in southeastern Iowa. And just like the grapes of wrath, they loaded up the truck and all the kids except the oldest one and moved to California. He turned out to be a mechanic. That's what he did. He was a mechanic in World War II in the Italy theater, and he was thought he was out and then got called back up and went back to Korea as a mechanic. And that's what he did for his whole life. He turned a wrench for over 50 years. My mom was a secretary in a school district office.
How did you decide to pursue a career in wildlife management?
I don't think we have enough time this afternoon to talk about how I got here. It wasn't an immediate decision, though, I can tell you that. I think the seeds for it were sown when I was a kid. I grew up around dogs, small game, not a lot of big game, although my grandfather had a deer hunting camp in California we went to every year. Did a lot of small game poaching. A couple of little kids, we were terrible, my buddy and I. We didn't know what a season was or an illegal species. I mean, we shot it all, equal opportunity. But in the hunting, but also just chasing through the woods and over the hills and messing around the stream. I think that's how most, maybe not all anymore, but many who get into wildlife work, they start off with an appreciation for catching bumblebees and butterflies and lizards and frogs and that sort of thing. And that's how I started. So I kind of grew up with it, although from about late teen years, for several years after that, I kind of got away from it, but I eventually came back to it. So I'd say that's what really sowed the seeds for my interest in wildlife.
Did you go to college first or do military service first?
Right out of high school, I tried college, and I wasn't ready. In fact, many would probably argue I was never ready, but anyway, I was really not ready back then. And I dropped out, and that's when Uncle Sam gave me a all-expense-paid trip to Vietnam, 1969.
What branch of the service were you in?
I was in the Army. Yay, all the applause breaks out, you know. It's just
So you did serve overseas?
I was drafted. I went willingly, but not enthusiastically. No, put it that way.
Did your military service in any way relate to your career later on? Did you gain skills, or did it affect how you...
I didn't learn a damn thing in the Army that's useful, you know. I shot a gun a lot, and that was about it. You have to excuse my weird sense of humor. That's how I get through life, basically, is making fun of myself in a lot of situations. But I guess I did learn a little bit about teamwork and command, I guess, probably is what I got, if anything, out of the Army.
Okay. Where did you go to college?
Well, when I decided to go back to college, which was 1972, it was here, UAF.
And how did you pick UAF?
I lived here.
Oh, okay, so let's take a jump back here. You got out of the Army and you moved to Alaska?
Well, I admire if there are any of you in this room that, you know, at a young age you figure out what it is you want to do and you go for it. I applaud you. I was not like that. I was all over the map, literally. After I got out of the Army, when I was there, every once in a while I'd ride in a helicopter or some aircraft, and I thought, you know, that'd be a pretty cool way to make a living. So after I got out of the Army, I decided I wanted to grow up and be a commercial pilot. So I went to a private flight school and completely blew the GI Bill benefits on that. By the time I got to the last section of learning to be a commercial pilot, I realized, oh dang, I don't want to be a commercial pilot. You know, my ladder is leaning against the wrong wall, so to speak. And at that point, I was pretty disappointed, I'll tell you. I was broke and had the beginnings of a career that I had no desire to pursue. So I thought, well, if I'm ever going to get up to see the North Country, I guess I should do it at this point in my life, because I was pretty undirected. So I thought, okay, what's a scientific way of getting to Alaska? So I turned to the Outdoor Life magazine, went to the back pages and looked at all the guide advertisements, and I wrote letters to all the guides. I said, hey, I'd like to come up and work for you. You know? And I got 2 responses. I probably sent out 24 of these. I got 2 whole responses. One was a brochure that the guide sends out to clients who inquire about hunting, so I threw that away. The other guy said, yeah, come on up, I'll give you room and board. So with my .30-06 and my rifle case, my duffel bag and a pack, I had enough money left, because I had a labor job there while I was making up my mind. I had enough money to buy a plane ticket to get here, and showed up in Fairbanks and spent my first night in a wall tent in Olness up on the Elliott Highway, and that's how it got started. So that's why I was here.
So you worked for the guide for how long?
Too long. Essentially from, I think it was in May when I got here, and it worked clear through to about October.
Okay. And by then you had decided to go to college, or that just came up next?
No. As a matter of fact, one day when I was sitting on the side of a mountain there in the Brooks Range, this is north of Arctic Village in the Junjik River Valley, I was sitting there and thinking about those kinds of things. You know, what am I going to do after this fun is over? I even flirted with becoming a guide for a while. But at that point, I was pretty sure that I needed to do something to get some skills that was going to get me into a line of work that I really wanted to do. And that was when the college idea came back to me. I'll tell you what really solidified the college idea. Skipping around a little bit, but I mentioned I went back to California to marry my high school sweetheart. We came back, and that was 1972, and by then the construction season had shut down, so I needed a job. So I went to work for the school district, working as a janitor over here at Old U Park School down at the foot of the hill. And that was an enlightening experience. One of my jobs in the middle of the night, since I often had the graveyard shift, was to go down into the basement of that school and dislodge the coal clinkers in the furnace. It was a coal-fired furnace then, and the coal would get caught in the auger and break the shear pins, and I had to go down and fix it. And to get down there, I had to come right up to the back end of the school with a glass door, and there was the university right there, the lights and everything on the hill. And as I come, wiping off the coal dust and getting ready to pick up the mop and clean the restrooms again, I thought, I bet there's a better way I could make a living too, and I'm really going to go to the university. So that really solidified the thought right there.
Did you know when you signed up then what field you were going to pursue?
No, not at all. I didn't jump right into wildlife work. I thought about it. I looked at the curriculum, and I thought it was really confining, and I had the bright idea that I wanted to keep my options open, so I stuck with biology. And it wasn't until after I graduated and got out of there that I fell into a circumstance that convinced me I wanted to work for the Department of Fish and Game. So it took a while.
So you met Jeannie, your lovely wife, in high school?
Yeah.
And you stayed in touch long enough to marry in 1972?
Yep.
Was she as excited about coming to Alaska as you were?
You'd have to interview her to figure out why the hell she stuck with me all these years, because I really drug her through some really interesting places and times. But I'm glad we're still married, 46 years or so.
Did she go to school here as well?
Only after she decided to change her career plans, and she wanted to get into teaching, so she began taking education courses here. But she has a bachelor's in bacteriology or something from the University of California at Davis.
Wow.
And for a while she worked here as a microbiologist for the state, and she worked here at IAB for a number of years as a research assistant. Great woman. She supported me while I was an undergraduate. I highly recommend it. It works really well.
Did you have children? 2. And do either of them, are they involved in wildlife at all?
No, for some strange reason they decided to go a different direction. My daughter is a special elementary special education teacher. Her husband actually is an electrical engineer on the staff here at the university, and our son got into design, industrial design and furniture design and stuff, and he's down in Seattle right now. He likes to fish. He doesn't hunt, and I think my daughter would like to hunt, but she's got 3 little ones right now that keep her pretty busy.
So you got a bachelor's in biology. What happened? How did you get your advanced degree?
Well, after I graduated with a general degree in biology, I realized it wasn't going to get me anywhere, probably. I was looking around for a job, and I saw, somehow I heard about the marine mammal program with the Department of Fish and Game here in Fairbanks was hiring. So I went there and did the interview with John Burns, pretty well known in the marine mammal field, to say the least. In fact, he's internationally known. And I got a job with him and Lloyd Lowry and Cathy Frost. There was another gentleman working there at the time too, Tom Ely. And after I started working there and was introduced to the wildlife field through marine mammal work, it really captured me. But one of the themes that you will probably hear me repeat, is what really captured me was the people I was working with. Not that they're all saints and great, but they're a really good, solid bunch of people, I thought. And some of them were really outstanding, good scientists, very objective, the way they dealt with data. Maybe not all of us, but some definitely were. Keep the rest of us honest, I would say. And after I came to the end of that, it was a 9-month term position. I couldn't work beyond that. At that point, I realized that I probably should have gotten a degree in wildlife management. But I decided, well, I'll see if I can get in grad school. And I did. At the time, Bob Stevenson had a grant to do some work up on the North Slope and needed some help in the form of a technician, and I dovetailed that job with getting into grad school here. And that was 77, I think, 1977.
So what was the topic of your master's?
Oh, I did a project on wolves. It was not too terribly specific, but it looked at movements, food habits, and as it turned out, I ended up, by happenstance more than anything, doing a little short, intensive study on summer predation rate of wolves on caribou on the North Slope.
Mm-hmm. Did that ever come in handy during your career?
Well, yeah. I mean, sure it did. Yeah, I did enjoy, especially, I had a real phobia, though, for the wolf politics, but the wolf as an animal and the interaction with caribou was extremely interesting. I really liked that.
Mm-hmm. When you started with the state, after the 9-month job, did you get another job with the state after that, or did you end up with another agency?
Let me see, how did that work? Well, after 2 field seasons on the grad project, things slowed down for me, and I feel kind of embarrassed to go into the details, but no, what the heck. The truth is, because if you get anything out of this, I think there'd be some lessons. For gosh sakes, don't do things the way I did, folks. But I got in a bit of a tiff with one of the members of my committee who slowed me down quite a bit. He and I didn't get along very well, to say the least, and I accept responsibility for at least some of that. If I was really honest, probably most of it. But it took me a while, and I was grinding through the data analysis and grinding through it. And frankly, it would have gone a lot smoother and faster if I'd worked with him and paid attention to it, but I was going to do it my way. And while I was doing that, just as I was starting the writing phase, a job interview came up with a job down in the Anchorage in South Central. And there was a Board of Game meeting, so I knew that the 2 bosses, the regional supervisor and the management coordinator, would be there. So I showed up on a little sidebar conversation. We had a short interview, and I got hired. So I went to Anchorage in 1980 is when I got hired. So that's where I started as a wildlife biologist in the regional office.
Mm-hmm. What was the pay and benefits back in those days compared to today?
That's an interesting topic, because I remember when I looked at that and the benefits, first of all, it's totally irresponsible in a financial way. I had no interest in making money, but at least I was bright enough to understand, well, you got to make a living. And back in those days, the benefits and the pay were very good. And I remember once that became apparent to me after I studied the paperwork, I guess you'd call it, and looked at talked to people, I realized, well, shucks, if this works out the way they say, one of the things I expect to do would be not have to worry about jumping from career to career. We're always looking for a better opportunity, that if the benefits and the pay were that solid, I was going to focus on the job 100% plus, and I did. And I wasn't the only one. I think back in those days, a lot of people do that. When I look at what folks your age are facing today in today's job market, and at least with the state, I haven't kept up with the federal stuff. You can't approach it that way. I think you're going to have to be basically more careful, and maybe looking for other opportunities. I hate to say it, might become a reality. Read the fine print on any hiring papers. I suggest you do that. I feel very comfortable and very fortunate. Various kinds of state benefits that have followed me through my career basically take financial worry away, unless of course the state goes completely bankrupt, then all bets are off. But I had this talk, I know, with my daughter and my son-in-law in particular, who are working here under the state system, and what they have facing them is completely different. It's a very different financial situation. I don't think it's, should preclude anybody from going into it, but people have to manage your own life and your own finances and your own future, and just watch out for yourself. I guess that's the advice I would have.
So you became a biologist, and what were your early duties? What was a typical day? What did you do?
Well, it was great. I got hired well, the Anchorage wasn't so great. I was just a regional biologist, a gopher biologist. I do a little bit here, a little bit there, help with a few surveys and so on and so forth. And I had the good fortune of getting out of there after 9 months. A couple of positions came open up in northwest Alaska. They just started a separate region, used to be part of Region 3. There were a couple of vacancies up there, and I just about broke the door down looking for an opportunity to get into rural Alaska. Because during my college days in particular, most of my recreational reading were old stories about the polar explorers. Hudson Stuck was one of my favorite, 1,000 miles by dog sled, 1,000 miles by boat or on the Yukon or whatever it was. I read a lot of those kind of stories, and I had some particular interest in the Native community. I did I did a fair amount of reading, and I have to say I was sympathetic to a degree to their situation. So early on I started developing an interest in why the Department of Fish and Game doesn't have that good a reputation of working with the Native community. Early on, that just became one of my things. It wasn't my driving factor, but I thought, how could this be? Here's a group of folks that for the most part really dig in and live off the land with, lots of modern modifications. If anybody should be easy to work with, it should be them, and yet we had, with a few exceptions here and there, we had some pretty bad situations. So that influenced me. And as soon as I got the job up in northwest Alaska, and that was one of the reasons I applied for it, out at Kotzebue, I thought, oh boy, now David's going to bring the great wisdom of modern wildlife management, and all the Native community is going to embrace me, and we're all going to get along. And the story turned out quite a bit different than that, I can tell you that. But it was satisfying and challenging, and I think I did accomplish a few things anyway.
So what were the high points of northwest Alaska?
One of them was not being in a regional office. My boss was down in Nome at the time, so there was lots of separation. And I just loved being in an office where if you did something right and good, you accomplished something, it became apparent. You could see the immediate results. And likewise, and this happened too, frequently enough, so that I haven't forgotten about it, if you screw up, you can't blame anybody else. It was like, oops, that didn't work out so good. One of those oops got me a private audience in front of 50 very, very irritated people in Selawik. I went there by myself, and the entire village was there, and they had everything except a noose hanging over a beam in the gymnasium. And it was something that myself and my assistant, who later became director of the division for a short while, had done a no-no when we were out doing aerial surveys. we interfered with a hunting party, is what it turned out to be. So that's what I mean by you get immediate feedback. You know, there's no filter, there's no big office, and you can hide. It's right there. So that was challenging.
How did it turn out?
Well, it turned out good. They didn't kill me, for starters. And we had a long talk about how we could do the surveys different in the future, where we got what we needed and they got what they needed, and I think it turned out fairly well.
Cool. What are the most useful tools or instruments or things that you used during your career that were always go-tos, either in the field or the office? Or
well, in rural Alaska, it was an airplane. You know, I already mentioned that I was trained as a pilot, so when I got on with Fish and Game, I went back to being a pilot as part of the job, which was just what I wanted. That fit. I liked that. I would have found it very difficult to work in rural Alaska, although some biologists do, without being a pilot. I think I would have gone nuts. But being a pilot, that helped me get out, in addition to also going out as a passenger and charter aircraft. So the ability to get around in those remote areas is extremely important. And one of the main things that we focused on when I first got there, tad bit of background, I hope I don't lose my train of thought, but that was a time when there was a lot of militancy in some of the villages, especially up north. Barrow was terrible. Kotzebue was getting there, just maybe 6 months behind it. But, I mean, to the point of being murdered. Somebody, one of the local individuals in Barrow, took a shotgun to a pack tent that was on the beach. It was a young couple just traveling out, and he killed them. That's extreme, but there was really nastiness out there. When I got to Kotzebue, they weren't welcoming people with open arms. I mean, it was really tough. So I thought, well, the good thing about that is there's nowhere to go but up, you know. As I saw it, as I got to know the area, we were pretty much bottomed out. One of my predecessors there had difficulty adjusting, let me put it that way. And later, I always reminded myself when I received a compliment every now and then about working with the communities out there, that, well, yeah, I look good. Anybody would look good coming after that. But what I was getting at is, because of that situation, part of my job originally was not just biology, but I had it written in my job description. I had to get out to each of had 12 communities outside Kotzebue that I had to cover, from Deering up to Point Hope. And it was interesting because that's not what I signed on to do, I can guarantee you. And every day when I looked at my schedule and said, oh shoot, I've got to go to Cayenne or one of those places I go, I did not want to go. It was hard. It was hard for me to get up, eat my oatmeal, put on my coveralls, jump in the airplane, or buy a ticket for a charter and do it. And what I remember distinctly is, at the end of every one of those days, after spending the time in the village talking about wildlife issues, regulatory issues, this and that, just getting to know people, went through a lot of tea and coffee in those days. Every time I came back, I was gratified and satisfied. I said, man, I'm glad I did that. And the interesting thing was, because I'm basically an introvert, is the next time it was time to go to the next village, I didn't want to do it again. So I don't know what that says about me, but every time I came back at the end of one of those days, I go, dang, that was time well spent. So it didn't have a whole lot to do with the fun part of the job, but I can tell you that putting that time and effort into developing that rapport developed a level of credibility and trust that allowed us to do the fun stuff, like being able to capture caribou in the water on the Kobuk River right in the middle of hunting season with hunting camps around. there was a time you tried that, you could get shot doing it, but we figured out how to do it. There's other examples. So for some strange reason, I liked working with people, and when there was any little breakthrough, any little thing where I could see a change in attitude, I just go, wow, that makes me feel great. To jump ahead, I could go on this topic for probably a solid hour, but what I think, there's no doubt in my mind that by the time I left, I was there about 7 years, between 7 and 8 years. I developed, I think, a level of credibility and trust. Most of the people there, most of the communities trusted me because they knew I wouldn't shine them on. If I had something to say that I knew they didn't want to hear, I'd say it, and they knew it. What I wasn't successful at least not very much, was I was hoping to engender that same level of trust for the agency I was working with. That didn't happen. That takes a lot of people a lot of years to get there, I can tell you that. And they had enough bad experiences from their point of view in the past that was not an easy hurdle to overcome.
So after you left Northwest Alaska, where did you head?
Well, I left too soon. I loved the job. There were plenty of challenges. But back in those days, there was the perception among many of us who worked in those remote areas that we would be stuck there forever. So the theory was, when a job opportunity came up somewhere else, in this case, I was not interested in being promoted. Thank you very much. I just wanted to go lateral. When a job came up, the theory was, well, you better start applying for it, because the chances you get it the first or even the second or third time won't happen, so you better start early. So I go, okay, I'll put in. So the job was for Sitka. And I got the job. I go, oh, dang. I knew for sure I didn't want to stay in Kotzebue forever, but I had another 5 years in me anyway, I think. But anyway, so I headed down to Southeast, and I wasn't sure what I was getting into. I had never been to Southeast Alaska. I left Blizzard in Kotzebue to fly down ahead of time just to case the joint and see if I really wanted the job. I stepped off the plane in Petersburg. It was February. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, not a breath of wind. It was 18 degrees. I was walking around with a short sleeve t-shirt. I thought it was just beautiful compared to Kotzebue. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. So we hustled out of Kotzebue, relocated there in Petersburg, and then spent several years living there.
How did the job change between Kotzebue and Petersburg?
Well, I went from the top of the salary schedule to the bottom. That was no fun. What I discovered is that the barge service from Seattle didn't cut you any slack. They figured out about what's a nickel less than what it costs to come up on air freight, and they charge you that. So financially, it wasn't a great move, but I just love that saltwater and mountain environment. I really do. The rain didn't bother me. I thought, so you get wet, you know. Try the North Slope sometime when the wind chill is -80, you know, in a blizzard or something. So I thought it was pretty slick. One thing I learned, there's Alaska, and then there's Southeast Alaska. And the people in Alaska, for the most part, don't know anything about the people in Southeast or what's going on in Southeast. They think they do, but they don't. And the people in Southeast don't give a damn what the rest of the people in Alaska think. So that was the conclusion I came to. In a lot of ways, many things different. Of course, it's a fishing culture through and through, and it was at the tail end of the real severe lumbering days where they were cutting down all of that climax forest and sending it over in cants, you know, squared off logs to Japan to turn into toothpicks, or well, a lot of it was turned into pulp. Sitka spruce being turned into pulp. If any of you are woodworkers out there, you realize what a travesty that is. They build airplanes with Sitka spruce. But anyway, it was different. Unfortunately, I didn't last very long there because after, about a year and a half, unfortunately I came down with a pretty serious illness, and I had to resign and go on full disability for about 3 years. And then by the time I got well enough to get back to work and whatnot, and then that brought us back to Fairbanks in '93.
I think we got a question.
Well, I thought he was just scratching his nose there.
David, I was just wondering, you were talking about moving laterally through these positions in Anchorage and Kotzebue and Sitka. Were you working at area biologist positions for all of those, or were they different levels?
No, when I was hired in Anchorage, I was a game biologist 2, they called him back then, which is the level of an assistant area biologist. And then I went to up north to Kotzebue as an assistant area biologist. And part of that story too, this was the great experiment by someone that Dick knows well. They took 2 of us assistant area biologists and stuck one of us an Ambler, that was me, and another one went down to St. Mary's outside of the area offices. And the whole idea then was to try to figure out a way to develop rapport and work to work more effectively with the native communities. So I think for both of us, the other gentleman, Steve Machida, he retired as regional supervisor of Region 5, but I think that helped a lot, but I can tell you the logistics of that were terrible because it's so remote, it's so difficult to get anything done. And most of my field work out of Ambler, which is way up the Kobuk River, was back towards the coast anyway. So it had its ups and downs. But anyway, while I was there in Ambler, the area biologist retired / resigned because there were 2 there. It was a shared position, 6 months. When they left, I applied for the job. That's when I was promoted to an area biologist. And then there was a lateral to Petersburg as an area. Yeah.
So you had different ecosystems, you had different species of wildlife and different people between Northwest and Southeast.
Yeah, but they were just as ornery. And, I always enjoyed that. Crusty old ornery native subsistence users and crusty old fishermen and loggers. I never tried to stay away from that. Unlike today, I talked maybe 1/10 as much as I listened. Because I always learned that I learned a lot more when I listened than when I talked. So I didn't say much, really. I listened a lot. When I had something to say, I tried to make it count. Although I do remember being frustrated trying to get an audience there in Northwest Alaska. And I got tired of showing up for advisory committee meetings. And for a while, that one area there had 4 or 5 different advisory committees, if you can believe that. And I'd go to a meeting, there'd be 5 people there on a good day. And I go, well, so then I hit on the idea, I knew that they really liked bingo and stuff like that. So what I started doing is when I rolled into one of these villages for a meeting, a special meeting for fish and game issues, I'd first go to the office that sold gas in the community, and I'd buy 2 5-gallon cans of gas. I'd pay for it. So okay, so I'd have a receipt, so I could send that to admin, and they'd think that I was using it for field work. And then I'd give numbers out and advertise this is a raffle. Whoever shows up at the beginning of my meeting and stays through the whole thing, at the end of it, you get the raffle. And you should have seen the room started filling up. I mean, I really had a crowd. And it worked really well. And I never got caught doing that, so I was kind of proud of that. And it helped. Another thing I learned was if you integrate yourself into their existing meetings, which is, back in those days, some of the villages were tribal councils, but some of them actually made more effective use of the city government, or, as it's laid out in state bylaws and all that stuff, what's required. And what I found out, if I wanted to get through to the community, I started asking, well, when's your next city or tribal council meeting, I get on the agenda, and then there were always a lot of people there too. So figuring out how to talk to people and how to get to them was really key. And some of those same things transferred down to Southeast. Just like I had pigeonholed trappers up in Northwest Alaska, when I went down to Southeast, I started looking in the fur sealing records. I could see who's doing the trapping in the area. I'd call them up, introduce myself, and say, I'd like to come and talk to you about trapping. And at first they'd be suspicious that I was trying to get the goods on them, and nail them. And then once they found out, I mainly just wanted to listen to them and find out what their issues were and what they thought should be changed or whatnot. It worked really good. So I have to admit that the results that got, the results that came from that kind of effort to do outreach to these communities paid huge dividends when it came time to pull off a caribou survey or a wolf capture effort or a moose this and that, and so on and so forth. We once had a really expensive major research project up out of Kotzebue, being run by individuals. Some of you might recognize the name Warren Ballard, fairly well known and published in research. He had a big project going that we were running out of Noatak. And we got going on it, 1 helicopter, at least 5 fixed wing, and we stayed right in Noatak, by the way. You don't do that in those communities unless you have several years of laying the groundwork. And myself and the guy I was working with had done that. We got the okay to work there. But sure enough, we got halfway through the project and somebody tried to torpedo it. Came there, got the crowd all riled up, sort of like a Donald Trump rally type thing, and they come sweeping through the area where it confronted us and said, you have to stop. And I thought poor Warren was going to have a mental breakdown because he thought the project was shot. And so clearly something needed to be done. You see everything falling down around you. My supervisor at the time, John Cody, and this was some of the mentoring I got from him. He didn't come and say, step aside, David. He said, do you need any help? I said, no, John, I think I can do this. So I went and found some of the key people in the community, got on the horn, called some of the big shots in Kotzebue, and I knew that was the time I was going to have to pull in some chits that I had developed. And I had to, essentially beg and say, okay, this project, I've got all this going on. This are the benefits of the project. This is what we're trying to do. Are you going to support me? These are the Schaefers, basically, in Kotzebue. And they did. The guy that was the ringleader there was neutralized. And so that's what I mean by, if in these jobs you think you just have to go out and deal with animals, you're going to get blown out of the water at some point. You really have to work with people. And the harder you work at that, it sets you up for success in doing what the job is really supposed to be about in the first place.
So after Sitka, you took about 3 years off for health reasons. Then you came back to the interior. What was it?
Well, I couldn't get out in the field still. I was recovering. I was pretty weak. So I was looking for an inside job, an office job. And it's a long story. The only one I found is with the Fish and Wildlife Service, actually, but with the subsistence division, not division, the subsistence management office. They had a job advertised as a subsistence coordinator working with the Eastern and the Western Regional Advisory Councils. So I thought, well, heck, I can do that. Now I worked with advisory committees. They are 100% native, Alaskan native, so I put in my application because I was desperate for some work, and I've been out of work in 3 years. And to make a long story short, I got the job. All the other coordinators, subsistence coordinators for the other groups around the state were all either, it was Yupik, Inupiaq, and Tlingit. And then here was this one lonely white guy sitting there, and I kind of wondered about that. I was 2 or 3 months into the job, and I asked my boss, it came up in some casual conversation, I said, what's going on here about, and I didn't understand the register system. What happened was that because I was a vet, if you get on the federal register at the time, I don't know if it's still the same, wherever you are, wherever you score on that, and I scored pretty high because of my past experience, nobody below you has a chance, because that veteran's preference is that. It's a veteran's preference, which is not the way the state did it. And I actually don't agree with the way the feds do it, even though I was a veteran. So that took me down a couple notches. I go, oh, I thought it was my qualifications that got me here, and it was just because I was a vet. But anyway, I stuck with that job for a year, and for my own sanity, and before I committed homicide, I needed to get out of it. So I went to work for the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, and I lasted a year and a half at that job.
Was there a significant difference between federal and state work areas?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, next question.
You know, I think I've gotten past the hurt part. First of all, let me say, after 2.5 years of Fish and Wildlife Service, I know they were every bit as happy to see me leave as I was as happy to go. So I'll give them that. But you could argue, by necessity, their focus is at a different level than when you work for the state. Ostensibly, it is the nation. Somebody in Louisiana cares about caribou in Alaska, and that to them is as good as gold. And I guess you could argue, I mean, I don't agree with that philosophy, but I can see that's a legitimate argument. So they are, in short, not nearly as responsive to local interests as the state can be. That's one thing I liked about the state. As cantankerous and as, polarized as things get at some time, I had the feeling through my career that when push comes to shove, if you get them into a room long enough, you can come to some kind of an understanding, and we're smart enough to get things done. I'm beginning to wonder about that now, based on our legislature and even Congress, but there was a time in the past when I believed that. So it inevitably, if you start with that different perspective, somewhere in getting the job done, it's going to be different. And it's hard to explain. It's hard to really articulate for somebody like me that's not all that articulate to begin with, what those subtleties and differences are. But once you're in the middle of it and can experience it, I can assure you it's just as real as that tape. It's different. And I got some friends, some people I really like in Fish and Wildlife Service and work with the feds. I respect them. I still do. It was not the right organization for me. But they do good work, and we cooperate with them a lot. We do get in some brouhahas on a fairly significant, regular schedule, but somehow we managed to get through it. At the end of that 2.5 years, a job came up with Fish and Game again here, the management coordinator, and once again, I just about blew the doors off the hinges, putting in my application for that and running down for the interview. And that was 1996. I came back to work for Fish and Game here in Fairbanks.
Okay, so you were the management coordinator.
As the management coordinator, yeah.
So you supervised all the area biologists in the interior.
Right, yeah. I thought, man, this job is just what I want. All it is an area biologist job with a supercharger on it. I thought, boy, it didn't take me long to figure out that was a bad call, because it's not like that. It's very much a supervision job, but I still, nevertheless, I liked it. I'd been away from stuff for 5.5 years at that point, so there was a bit of a learning curve to get back in the swing of things. And I'm not the world's fastest learner. All you slow learners out there, keep that in mind. Don't give up. It took me about 4 years to figure out how to do the job. I was just getting into it. I started thinking, hey, I think I can be effective at this. I even know where the Japan Hills now are, and the Tanana Flats and all that stuff. And then my supervisor resigned. Well, actually, he retired. he retired. That was the regional supervisor job. And so I kind of kept low, waiting to see who was going to apply for it, and I would regularly check in with the director of the division down in Juneau. Is anybody applying for it? No. No. And so finally, in self-defense, I applied for it because I think we were on the verge of having to advertise outside, you know, and our division has some interesting experience advertising outside of our agency. I can think one director comes to mind, Dick, that didn't work out too well. So I thought, well, I may not be the world's answer to that job, but I'm afraid of what could happen. So I applied for it. Sure enough, once again, my outstanding qualifications were there were no other applicants. So I got the job.
How long were you regional supervisor?
Let me see, 15 years. 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, yeah.
I really appreciate what you've spoken about here. It confirms something that I had to learn, that you had to learn. You're a wildlife biologist, but the species who has the most challenge, most difficulty and most challenging to work with and manage, quote unquote, Homo sapiens.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And if you are unsuccessful at that, or have limited success, then the wildlife management end of it is really impaired. In our society, and especially in Alaska where it's so public, you have to be able to work with the public in order to affect good programs for fishing game.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah, with that said, Nick, if I'm allowed to jump around a little bit.
Please do.
Just so I provide some small ray of hope out there. One of the really fun things that happened to me when I was hired as the assistant and went to Kotzebue was the AB there at the time, the area biologist AB, said, well, we're going to split chores up here. He says, one of the things I want you to do is be in charge of our sheep management program. What? Sheep? Okay. He said, well, let me know what you need. So being relatively fresh out of grad school, some of that stuff had stuck. One of the most important courses I ever took was vertebrate population dynamics, and the other one, I would argue, was scientific sampling with Sam Harbaugh. And I go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? So I actually went back to what I'd learned at the university. You can believe that. And I said, what would I like to know? I didn't start with what do I need to know. What would I like to know? So I started laying out, well, you know, all the basic stuff, lifespan and fertility and productivity, all that. I started, and I had this big old outline. So then by the time I was done, I had 3 or 4 pages. And I went, how am I going to do this? So then I had the idea, well, at the time we had 2 sheep research biologists in the state. One was Wayne Heimer here at Fairbanks. The other was Lyman Nichols down in Cooper Landing. And Wayne was a lot closer, so it'd be cheaper for me. So I called up Wayne. I said, hey, Wayne, this is what's been dumped on me. I don't know anything about managing sheep, but I have an outline. How about if I buy you a ticket, would you come up here for a few days? There was this long, long pause. I thought maybe we'd been cut off. I go, Wayne? He goes, nobody's ever asked me to do that before. No management biologist has ever asked me to do that before. Some of the management biologists might argue there was a reason they hadn't, but nevertheless, I bought the ticket for Wayne. He came up, and it was a great 2 or 3 day tutoring program. We went through it, and we paired out things, and this is what we needed. And then I had enough of a budget where I was allowed to go forward with that and start implementing the types of surveys we did and the type of data that we collected. So, you know, that's where the juice is. You know, that's why people want to work with wildlife. So there are bright moments. I don't want you to think it's all, you know, a social welfare department or something. It's not like that at all. But you need both of those components in there to be effective.
Well, that's kind of a jump off, and the next thing I was going to ask you is just pick one, what was a really interesting project you were involved with at any level during your career?
Well, there's more than one.
You don't have to limit it to one.
Well, if we want to be here all night, I got to try to prepare it now. Of course, the wood bison thing, that occupied me for 19 years. So that was probably that was the biggest one. For my career, when I look back on it, the part that I played in wood bison was definitely the cherry on top of the cake or whatever. So that was the biggie.
Describe the role you played.
Well, I was the guy that identified it as a priority for a region. Initially, it was not a priority for the division. They weren't all that interested in it, frankly. But one of the good things about being regional supervisor is you do have quite a bit of influence over what happens in your region. In fact, at times, although I would never admit this to any director, over the years, if I was director, I'd crank in that particular regional supervisor over there, or that other one. Of course, I was always perfect. But you can do that. You do have a lot of influence. So in the early years, when there wasn't much enthusiasm for it, there was a cadre of people, in this office that wanted to push for it. Even some in the Fairbanks office weren't all that hot on it. It did take a lot of, I wouldn't call it shell games. We had to guard the budget, identify the priorities, not suck so much money and people away from the other programs. The other programs had to get done because they were a priority. But was able to continue to oversee that. I directly supervised the folks that worked on the program. It was separate from everything else we did in the office, so I just carved out a little chunk and I supervised them. Part of that story is I first heard about wood bison back when I was working for the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. And I heard that Bob Stevenson, whom I knew from, like I said, back from being a grad student, was trying to get wood bison reintroduced to the Yukon Flats. I didn't know what a wood bison was, and I'm not making that up, not trying to be funny. Wood bison. That must be bison that live in trees. There are different subspecies. Some geneticists would probably argue that, but behaviorally they're different, morphologically they're different. And I thought, well, that's stupid. Why would you want to introduce a non-indigenous species to Alaska? No, you might as well ask for giraffes. I'll skip a lot of the details, but that was pretty much the widely held opinion by staff at the refuge at the time. And as I started learning about it, talked to Bob, excuse me, started reading literature, I go, well, I'll be danged. What do you know? They were here. Yukon Flats, Porcupine River gravel bars are littered every year. Every year, at least one specimen of a small horned bison comes out of there. The most recent one is only 400 years, between 400 and 500 years old, came out of Ship Creek in Anchorage. So they were here, folks. They were truly here. We had if I could say, a hell of a time convincing a lot of folks in the federal agencies that was legitimate. Finally, the people working on it, Bob was the biologist, of course, working on this, finally prevailed. He worked with a lot of folks here at the university, Dale Guthrie, Craig Gerlach, others not in the universities, but academics elsewhere, to put together one of the most, I think, riveting multidisciplinary papers that I've ever read on the history and whatnot, and ethno-history even of wood bison. So it became really clear. I became a convert. I started out being very, very skeptical. And then I was a convert, and I go, well, dang. They had wood bison specialists from Canada, Cormac Gates being one of them, and others, botanists who are familiar with grazing habits and nutritional needs of bison, come over. They looked at the Yukon Flats and they said, this is better than anything we have in Canada, where they have reestablished wood bison. They have both diseased populations there, but they also have several disease-free populations scattered. So once I hit that level of being sure of myself, I guess, assuredness is the word, that's when I really dug in my heels. I thought, okay, we got to see this thing through. So it was a whole series of moving people around. And again, it's fun to be in a position like region supervisor because you do have the authority to make some pretty significant staff changes. Bob Stevenson became interested in the wood bison while he was an area biologist. Pretty soon, 85% of his time is spent on wood bison. Well, he's in charge of Yukon Flats, eastern North Slope, and everything else. So there was a lot of work that was receiving, shall we say, minimal attention. So I had to make a personnel shift there, jimming things around so that Bob was working full-time on bison at that point. Then he could do 100% instead of only 85 or 90%. And then we had other people come in and fill in behind him and actually do a more thorough job at area biologist. And so it's always a matter of trying to find the balance. At one point, I thought I was smart enough, and Bob was smart enough, that we could take care of the planning and community meetings ourselves. Boy, was I wrong there. When we became overwhelmed and hit the limits of our abilities, we had a planner at the time, Margaret Matthews, she still is here in Fairbanks, who had finished a stint with headquarters in Juneau, was assigned back to the region, so I assigned her to it. And she held on to the job for maybe a year or two, made as much progress as she could. And that's when it was time to, again, work with people. Not just the biology, but work with people. And but she retired. At that point, I had another planner in the office. And, excuse me, this happens when I talk a lot. I usually don't talk a lot when my voice starts going. Randy Rogers, Luke's dad. And he had been going through a whole series of moose planning, management plans in different parts of our region. And he was kind of sitting on the sidelines watching us flub one of these planning approaches or dealing with the public after another. And finally he said, "Hey, David, I think I can help you with that." I said, "Okay, boom, that's it. You're done with the others. You're full-time wood bison." So then we had a full-time wood bison team. Anyway, I give those two examples that the satisfying part of the job was I was able to hire or redirect staff who had the real expertise and did the real work on wood bison to get the job done. So that turns out it worked pretty well. And then, of course, I should mention Tom Seaton's name. Tom has turned into a quintessential bison biologist. I think someday here he's going to be known around North America at a minimum. He's already known in Canada, because when we rescued him from his assistant area biologist position and the Fairbanks office, because his boss, Don Young, the area biologist, said, in so many words, find something else for him to do. He's mastered this. He's ready for something more of a challenge. So we snatched him out of there, made him the buffalo biologist, as we call him. And it started from ground zero. He said, "Well, I got a lot of reading to do." I said, "Yes, you do, brother, get with it." And he has excelled at it. He's done very, very well. So we've been fortunate to get the right people, the right time. We're able to scrounge around, hook them up, and get the job done. It only took 19 years. Well, actually, it took longer than that because Bob started working on that project 3 or 4 years before I got there. So it was 93, maybe he started on it.
But for 19 years, you supervised the staff. And is it safe to say that you did not have a great deal of support for that from your supervisors in Juneau?
Well, at first, finally, I'm not sure that I won them over so much with my brilliantly sophisticated arguments. They just realized that I wasn't going to go away and quit. So they finally figured, well, I guess we better get it done. I don't know. I'm just kidding. No, it became clear that this was a conservation opportunity that people in wildlife don't get very often. You get to reestablish an indigenous population into part of their historic range. It doesn't get any better than that. It's right up there with, I don't know how many of you saw, if anybody reads a newspaper anymore, there was a story about the Aleutians and the Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, and what's his name? Ebert, is that his last name? He retired. He was well, he was a trapper is what he was, but he was a biologist on the staff, and he worked for years on a bunch of those islands to get out the introduced Arctic foxes. And they have reestablished cackling geese, a lot of the seabirds, all kinds of birds have reestablished. That's, I think, where the real honeypot is for wildlife work in our profession. So I think wood bison ranked right up there, and I was just really fortunate to be able to help with that project, and even more fortunate to have some really good people work on it.
And keeping it alive for 19 years that you were supervising.
It got a little bit old, yeah. There were times when I actually thought about throwing in the towel, and then the stubbornness kicked in. You have a good idea, be very, very reluctant to let go. That's all I can say. But it won't be fun doing it.
So how did that story end, the wood bison project? It's still going on. What was the end for you?
Well, the end for me was to see them out there on the land. That was the thing. And in 2015, memory starts to go. In 2015, the first shipment went out, and that was all cows, calves, and young bulls. In other words, the smaller bodied animals. They went by air cargo out to Shagaluk. And Tom, and working with Darren Bruning, by the way, who replaced me as regional supervisor now here in the Fairbanks office, worked very closely on that part of it, supervising that. And with Mike Miller and his group down at the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center in Portage, where the bison were kept for a number of years waiting to be released. And they shipped 100 of those got them there, and 100 of those animals walked out of those shipping containers at Shagaluk into the holding pens there. That was after being, you know what Connexes are, the steel shipping containers, 40 feet long, 8 by 8. They were modified to hold bison, all kinds of things with cutting torches and stuff. All of them walked off alive. And then, since there was still some money left over, which Tom was magnificent in managing, boy, he could pinch a penny. The rest were bulls. Another 30 in bulls were shipped. They had to go by truck to Nenana, get on a barge, go down the Yukon River, go up the Anoka River to an area near the village of Shagaluk, and released. All 30 of those got off and walked out. Other relocations of animals, reestablishing animals, are just rife with stories about high percentages of animals that die. It's just, I had written it off. I said, well, a certain percentage of these animals are going to die. That's just the way it is. And to me, that all 130 walked off. Now, some of them weren't in real good shape, because within days they started, establishing their pattern of wandering around. There were a few of the weak ones did succumb. There's no doubt about it. But there were no capture or transport mortalities. And folks, that's in the record books. I can guarantee you. People that work with bison or transplanting any kind of animals around the world can appreciate the accomplishment. So I was really, really proud of that.
Does anything stick out in your mind as a particularly dangerous or frightening experience you had as a biologist or as a supervisor?
Well, me flying the airplane was scary sometimes. Yeah, well, one time flying back to Ambler, I got caught in the whiteout that started coming down, and I was dodging treetops. And I was trying to decide if I had enough gas to punch through and go up on top and find a clear spot, or just take my chances and land on the river. I was still on wheels. And just as I was about ready to flip a coin, I recognized one of the houses in Amber. I went right by and go, dang, I know where I'm at. And I just turned. And I followed the street in Ambler, and followed the road out to the airport. And then, in those days when you got up there, the road veered off. So when I got to where it veered off, I just pointed. I was in my little Super Cub, and pretty soon there it was, and I shut that down. I got out and I kissed the ground. I kissed the ground. Another time that I think was hilarious was I was out capturing wolves. I put radio collars on them, not having very good luck. The snow tracking conditions were horrible, but we did manage to find one. A gentleman who's no longer, well, alive, or certainly working for Fish and Game now, by the name of Tim Smith, who worked out of Gnomes with me. And we had the wolf down, went down, did all the measurements and take the blood and do this and that, and slap the collar on. And it was just getting used to using a new drug, and I can't even remember what it was now, but it was one that had an antidote. And after we were done, I gave it a shot, and I mainlined it by accident. You know, I hit a vein, and it went right to its heart. And boom, it popped up and started running. As soon as I saw it come to life, you know, I have a master's degree, I'm smart, so I turned around and I started running. I heard, what should I do? What should I? And I turned around, and Tim Smith has a hold of the wolf's tail, and the wolf's dragging him. And I go, Tim, let go of the wolf. You know, so that's what happens when you're supervisor. You know, you have to give this really astute advice. So that could have turned out differently, you know, if the wolf would have had enough wherewithal to turn around. He could have removed a hand really fast. But anyway, it took off, and we were good.
I'm glad you thought of the correct answer.
Yeah, thinking under pressure. I was always good at running away from those situations. You know.
What do you think was one of the most difficult things you had to overcome during your entire career?
Appreciating the opposing point of view, even within staff. There was one guy, a person on the staff in Region 5, with whom I think our supervisor, John Cody, used to set his watch every time we got together in a meeting by how soon it would take me and Carl to get into an argument. Carl was just a great guy. Give you the shirt off his back. He and I had different attitudes about how you try to develop rapport with the Native community. I can laugh when I think back on this. We had to argue, and finally the boss would get sick of it. It's okay, shut up and let's get on. Okay, so we sit down and get on with stuff. And Carl and I got along fine outside that. But that and any other number of things that I can tell you about, I realized at time, although it's great when you get more experience and you get more confidence in your own judgment, in a way it becomes harder to appreciate someone else whose idea you initially think, boy, that's stupid, you know, and that sort of became my signal. If my knee jerk was, boy, that's stupid, and I go, wah, 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 okay, wait a minute, you know, maybe it's not stupid. And frequently it wasn't stupid. It was different. Many times I changed my mind, and many times if I didn't change my mind, I at least understood better why the other person thought differently about how to do jobs. And I can guarantee you there's no one right way to do a job. Almost every job out there can be conquered with any number of different approaches.
What was the most pressing issue you ever had to deal with, and how did you resolve it?
Pressing issue. Well, that little scenario I already shared about being a no attack with that pretty darn expensive research project, it just almost blew up in our face. That was pressing. I felt nervous, I have to admit, in getting that one straightened out. The other stuff, one pressing issue, oh, this is a good one. I failed. This was a learning thing for me. It's probably an in-house joke, but I don't know if you ever heard about the miracle at McGrath. But back during the Knowles administration, people in McGrath had experienced a very, very downturn in the moose population, and it was hard to harvest moose. And they were begging to get wolf control, predator control of some kind out there. The wolves was the initial focus. So we were going through all kinds of hoops and stuff that were set up because the Knowles administration didn't want to get involved in predator control. That's what it boiled down to. Unfortunately, they wouldn't come out and say that. They said, well, the bar's kind of high. You got to do this. You got to. So we were going through a series of meetings and so on and so forth. And of course, we were trying to gather more data. More data is always good when you're in a tough situation if you have the money to get it. So the area biologist out there at the time conducted a moose population estimate survey. It was a lousy one. He said, boy, this is really lousy. Bad viewing conditions, snow conditions, stuff. But this is what it shows. And it came out really low. It's like 3,000 moose in this huge gargantuan area surrounding McGrath. So we knew it was suspect, and we tried to temper that. Say, look, this is the best we can do. We think it's undercounted, but we don't know. At least it's some data. Well, that allowed the predator control trade to start gaining some steam, so it was headed in that direction. The next year, he repeated the survey, better conditions, and boom, the population estimate was twice what it was before, which was, okay, that actually makes more sense. I was still the management coordinator. I was in the office by myself. I had to get a call, got a call from the commissioner and the deputy commissioner. I will not mention any names. They said, David, where's Dan? He was the regional supervisor. Well, he's not here. Well, we just got this news. This changes everything, doesn't it? So at that point, not being experienced in being careful what you say when you're talking to headquarters, I said, well, yeah, it changes everything. And they didn't hear a word I said after that. It was, I talked myself a blue streak. But because of my impulsive, well, yeah, then I was going to explain the nuances. You don't explain nuances to people at that level making those kind of decisions when you know what the decision is they want to make. And that just kiboshed it for several years. I mean, that killed it for the rest of the administration. We couldn't get anywhere. Had I said the logical answer would have been, well, actually, no, it doesn't change anything at all. Because it doesn't matter what the population estimate was, and it's a very scientific random sample type survey, Jaberhoof survey they did out there. What matters is what are people able to harvest out there that depend on the moose. And they were having a difficult time for several years there. That didn't change, so the need was still there, but man, that was like, so that was one of David's learning lessons at being dealing with issues at the more political level. That was kind of pressing. I felt very depressed and very challenged by that one.
If you had to limit yourself to 3 significant contributions you made to conservation in Alaska, what would those 3 be?
Well, eventually I retired, so that cleared the way for new ideas. One thing I haven't mentioned here is I'm kind of proud of the work that the region did on intensive management. And that tends to be a kind of a hot button issue with a lot of much of the public in Alaska. Intensive management started out of frustration right here in Fairbanks with a trend towards what less active management, more to benign or management or monitoring. You know, where you go out, you assess the population, you determine, well, this can't stand any human harvest right this year, so we'll limit you or cut you out. That was the kind of syndrome that was frustrating because folks, because the way our funding works, hunters were paying the bulk of the bills then, not entirely, but the vast majority of it. A group got together in town. They started working with the legislature, and I'll leave out all the really interesting details, I think. But anyway, they came up in 1994 with the intensive management statute, I'll call it. And that required that when these kind of situations arise, Fish and Game should try to do something about it. It might not be predator control, it might be this, it might be that, but try to do active management. So the Board of Game, of course, picked up that banner and ran with it, but they were trying to implement regulations straight from the statute. If you know anything about regulation statutes, and I didn't at your age, I could care less, but it's hard, usually it's hard to do that. What you need to put the statutes really to work is you work with regulations. In the federal process, it's called rulemaking, where the agencies actually make regulations, but they do that under the umbrella of the law itself, or the statute in state lingo. So that wasn't working well. The way the board was implementing it throughout the state was very uneven. It was confusing to the public. So once again, in this region, this predates me, decided there were no regulations. We need regulations. So at the time, as far as my perspective on this is somewhat spotty, but I think chiefly a previous regional supervisor, Chris Smith, started working with the legislature, a gentleman by the name of mainly Bert Sharp, and with other people involved, came up with the regulations. I call that the second milestone, intensive management. It provided a much more definable, cohesive approach for the board to follow to deal with that issue. Well, we chugged along for a few years, and then one day, I guess I was in my office with my feet up on my desk, and I thought, you know, something's missing here. I think we need more structure. Maybe that's being a bureaucrat. So I started talking to staff about a protocol. You know, we need a protocol, something that by the time we get to the board, we aren't in a reactionary phase, we're in a proactive. Let's take this bull, no pun intended, by the horns, and when we come to the board, instead of being told by the board, well, you hit these trip wires, you now have to start doing this, you have to do this. Let's put ourselves in the position when we get in front of the board, well, we've hit these trip wires, and this is what we plan to do. This is what we want to do. And I'm biased, obviously, but we became much more effective at that stage, because when we were then when the board and us had to consider these competing interests, like that management area over there wanted attention to make a change to habitat or predators, this one or whatever, we had amassed enough information, we could say, we suggest this is the priority. And even though we hit the trip wires where technically the law and the regulation required us to do intensive management in Area A, because we had a no BS argument about, we think this is a greater need and this is all the money we have anyway. Let's put that one on the back burner and let's focus on this. And that changed life a lot for us. And I was really almost happy with that. That was the third milestone, was the protocol. It was somewhat impressive. The guy that really led the charge, many people worked on it, but the guy that really led the charge on that was Tom Paraguay. Tom was recognized with a national award for that, the Ernest Thomas Seton Conservation Award or whatever. So Tom was the one that was really the powerhouse behind that one. And then, by then I'm getting towards the end of my career. I thought, oh, what the heck, we need another idea here. I thought, you know, what might really help next is an evaluation of this process. Let's go back and look at this trail of intensive management efforts that we made and consolidate them, examine them, weigh them against each other, and put them out there for the public and the Board of Game to look at and say, this is what we've learned. It worked over here, it didn't work here, and we think it didn't work because. So I thought that the evaluation, which isn't done yet, but it's an official federal aid project for Tom Paraguay. Whenever I stop by the office now, I stop with him and say, Tom, how's it going? You know, and he brings me up to date. But that would be, what are we up to, milestone 5 now?
4.
But I like to think that most of that came from this region, from the interior. We had people, smart, hardworking people that were willing to work on it. And a very invigorating public. Trust me, these guys will force you to stay on your toes. And I like that. So with Bison, I think for the region, intensive management, I was pleased with how much progress we made on a topic that's tough to deal with, because a lot of people, you say intensive management and their eyes turn red. So it was challenging, but I thought it would be, what the staff did was bring a lot of scientific legitimacy to that approach.
What would be your best advice for a young conservationist that wants to work in the field these days?
Well, if you're absolutely convinced you don't want to be a banker or a lawyer or a doctor or something, where you can make real money, I think that it has to be an avocation, a calling. You know, you have to be one of those kind of people that what would life be worth if you didn't have the outdoors and the natural environment and the ability to interact with it? You don't have to even be a hunter. You can be a photographer or whatever. Somebody likes to view it. But if you have that connection to wildlife, just realize there are a lot of avenues there for you. But when you choose an avenue, whether it's kind of like me, I may not have been the most blood and guts hunter, well, I know I'm not in fishing game, but I'm strongly oriented that way. Or whether you have, you know, you're more into what's frequently called the conservation biology. The worst thing that can happen is, I think my advice would be, is to work to overcome those barriers, or at least understanding between this potential for polarization. Because when you talk about getting on your high horse, polarization has permeated our society to a degree that really alarms me now. All the way from national politics. You have essentially a Congress that can't do anything anymore. The state legislature is not much better, in my opinion. And if that kind of polarization seeps in any lower into our society, and now more specifically into those of us who think wildlife is really something worth devoting your life to, we're screwed, because wildlife is going to need all the advocates, you know, all the allies you can get. And if you have bird watchers and trappers and hunters and photographers and all the rest hand in hand, you're going to accomplish a lot more. That's my opinion.
Who are 3 people you think have been very influential in the field of wildlife management?
Well, the first one was John Burns, who I mentioned was my first wildlife job ever. John is, to say the least, a bit of a character, very charismatic. I'm not. That's not my style. But when I worked for him, I saw how he operated in terms of scientific objectivity. Of course, he was in research his whole career. That impressed me, and sort of the influence that John had on others. But that was the first hook. So not too many years ago, I told him, I said, John, did you realize you were my first mentor? He goes, what? Me? You know, he couldn't even believe it. So he was certainly big. Other people I really appreciated was the time, my supervisor, John Cody, for many years, John's still here in Fairbanks, he's retired. I really liked John's very even-handed, cool hand Luke type approach to management. Didn't always agree with him about what to do, but I liked how he did it, I have to admit. Keeping an even keel when things are threatening to fly apart is very important for getting something done. I always thought this gentleman over here was a class act, Dick. You can advocate, you can have strong feelings, but if you're willing to listen and work with other people, Dick's a great model. I remember you were part of that, what was it called, the Listen Project or something, you and Mary some years ago? That Quaker-oriented thing about trying to bridge the gulf between urban hunters and native subsistence hunters from the rural areas.
Sponsored by the Friends.
Yeah.
Quakers.
You know, what I learned from those years, well, let me tell the whole story. By the time I got back to Fairbanks in here, who was the assistant governor or whatever it's called, Fran Ulmer? Was that her name? She was, for Tony Knowles, whoever his sidekick was.
I think she was lieutenant.
He put her in charge of solving the subsistence problem.
Right.
That should be a piece of cake, right? Fran's very, very intelligent, well-educated, very experienced woman. But I thought, you know what she needs? She needs some of my advice. So I sat down and I wrote this. I mean, I put my heart and soul into this, about a 3-page letter. I said a little bit about myself, what my experience was living in an urban area, hunting in those areas, as well as being out in the bush, so to speak. And I said, you're not going to come up with a compromise or a solution to the controversy that exists right now because there's too much ignorance on both sides. I said, anything that you think is a solution now is going to be short-lived and it's not going to work. Because what I learned was that, and I had many a campfire talk with the native subsistence hunters out there, many of whom couldn't speak very good English. Their English was way better than mine, in fact. But they were completely screwed up in how they characterize a typical urban hunter. It's like, oh, they cut the heads off and they don't care about this and that, and all they want is the trophy. They're just doing it for fun and stuff. Like, you know, holy mackerel, how are we going to bridge that gulf? Likewise, I talked to urban hunters, you know, on the advisory committee or whatever, and they were just as ignorant the other way. Oh, those bunch of wasteful subsistence hunters, they get welfare and they do, and there was so much lack of communication and so much misunderstanding. You can't come up with a constructive solution in that kind of an environment, in my opinion, until you go back to the basics, which is, we better address this issue. So I thought, boy, I'll probably get a letter back with an emblem stamped on it for thanks. And I got this little short form. Thank you very much for your input. We got this under control. Have a nice day. So, anyway, I didn't have any influence on that at all. I'd have to run for governor, and I'm dang sure not going to do that.
You're a member of the Wildlife Society. Has that affected your career?
Well, I did let that membership lapse. Scott and I had that conversation earlier. He's trying to shame me, but yeah, I was a member for many years.
We don't have to go into deep detail. So I know this is going to be kind of a summary statement because you've already mentioned so many parts of it, but what do you think makes a good wildlife manager, and what skills do you think are absolutely important?
Well, I'm not going to pretend like I'm the guru on the top of the mountain, but I can relate to you what I learned. About towards the end of my sojourn up there in the Kotzebue area, the Nana region, Area 23, Game Management Unit 23, I worked really hard to develop credibility. And I also learned that's not like, you don't work to make people like you. I didn't care if anybody liked me. I just took that off the table. But they had to trust me. That's what I focus on. So one time I was thinking, well, trust, what do you do? Look up Webster Dictionary or wherever it is on the computer these days, online. So I thought, well, what do I think it means? And I came to the conclusion that it's a three-legged stool. You have to be honest. You have to be honest. If there's ever bad news that you screw up, you better be the first one to tell somebody. And if the data you collected on a particular survey wasn't the best in the world, you better put that right out there in front. On the other hand, if you think you had good data, fight like hell to advocate for it. But anyway, you got to be honest, and that's, yeah, sure, I can be honest. I can tell you, folks, sometimes that's hard, because the temptation to maybe not do a bald-faced lie, but kind of scoot things a little more, where they're more comfortable, can become a challenge. Be honest. Be fair. You cannot be biased. The public will sniff that out in a minute. They'll know if you're biased. I once read a paper, I saw a researcher from a different part of the state that had gotten some flack, and it was being criticized for being biased. And his supervisor said, well, I don't see any bias. I said, well, send it to me. I deal with a group here in Fairbanks that I think I know their lingo. I think I know it. I read the paper. I didn't even get past the first introduction, the first page in the introduction. I go, this guy's biased. There was a word in there. So anyway, going back to Kotzebue, I learned that early on is be fair, which is the same thing as not being biased. The other is, let's face it, you got to be competent. I mean, if you think that when you screw up or something doesn't go well, and you go admit it to the public, say, okay, apology accepted, we still like you. If you do go to that well very often, pretty soon you're dead meat. So you got to be competent. You know, it takes hard work. You don't have to be the smartest person in the world, but you got to be one of the hardest working people in the world. So those are the three: honesty, fairness, and competency. Later on, as I, through hook or by crook, moved up in the promotional ladder, what I realized is that's really good advice, I think, for how to do stuff. It doesn't tell you what to do, though. And that's in a different arena. You got to do stuff right. But as you go up higher, you've got all these different competing priorities. You only have so much money. And pretty soon you have to develop the sense of, oh my God, how do I figure out what the priority is? So then it becomes not just you got to do it well, you got to do the right thing well. And there are actually trainings and formal exercises you can go through. I've tried a number of them myself to help learn that. I think I gained some skill in that arena. I don't think I was the best, but I at least arrived at a level where I could look at myself in the mirror at night, which is important, and we made some real progress overall. So I think I may have let it slip a little earlier. You said three things. One's Bison, the other's intensive management. I do think that I accomplished something in working with the Native community in Northwest Alaska. It went from, when I first went to my first meetings in that community, I was threatened. And I was just too gung-ho and probably too stupid to take it seriously, so I just kept showing up. And finally, they must have figured out, this guy must be stupid, so they let me stay there. But I was satisfied. Like I said, the trust didn't transfer to the agency, at least immediately, but at least we started with inroads. And they had a guy that showed up, good old Jim Dow, who did his entire career there, who really cemented that relationship. But the issue is, one of the dangers in working in a local area is that you don't become completely captured by the local. You are a state employee, and you do have obligations to the entire state. So that was one of my lessons too. Yeah, sorry I'm wandering so much.
No, that's okay. at this stage, we've got about 10 minutes left. Anybody has questions, this would be a good time to jump in. Otherwise, my last question to you, David, is what do you see as the future of wildlife management, and is there anything else you'd like to see?
Only young people will be able to have the stamina to overcome the challenges. Guys, my tank is just about empty. You know, I like to dabble around, do a little bit here and there, but the challenges are amazing. Climate change, global warming. Bear with me. One of the main problems we had, and thank God for, well, Luke's gone now, but his dad, Randy, was our key on this. The main problem we had with getting bison released was we became entangled with the Endangered Species Act. Now, I won't go into that. We don't have another hour, and I don't have that much voice left, but it was very difficult. Since then, since I've been retired now a couple of years, I've been very curious about what we did right or wrong that got us so crossways with that, although we eventually conquered it, thank goodness. So recently I read just finished a couple of books written by experts, people with experience in dealing with endangered species in the lower 48 almost entirely, with a few mentions about Alaska. And how that's been sucked into the global climate change fight, where advocacy groups are attempting to use that to address things like emissions, you know, trying to cut that down. I mean, it's serious. You know, the latest news thing I saw was, that reanalysis of the data for the Arctic circumpolar area, and it's like, what, 6 times faster than they thought it was, or worse, or whatever it is. I mean, some political types will only be able, some will deny it right up to the apocalypse, I'm convinced. But the rest of humanity is smart enough sooner or later to realize, you know, we're going to have to adapt. I think it's a fool's errand to think we're going to turn it back to what it was. The challenge is, how are we going to adapt, minimize it, ameliorate it, do whatever, change what we're doing here or there in order to survive. And the wildlife is oddly enough turned out to be almost right at the point of the spear right now for people working in that arena. So I don't have any advice about how to tackle that. You know, that's for you all, the next generation. But I wish you well. I'll be sitting on the sidelines cheering you on. But I think that it's not going to be the same. It's going to be very challenging. That's what I see as the main one. One of the other sort of subsidiary ones that bothers me a great deal is more and more people coming into wildlife, and I suspect there are at least some of you in this room don't come from the same kind of rural background that me and many others do, where we grew up with a loaded shotgun behind the door in the living room type thing, you know, or out on land where you go hunting. A gun is just a tool. It's like a hammer in the toolbox. You don't see that anymore. So I think there's a growing lack of empathy for the ancient art of survival, of taking one sustenance from the land. In order for something to live, something's going to die, I guarantee you. You can be vague, something's going to die so you can live. That's, as I see, a universal rule. So again, I was talking before about different factions of wildlife enthusiasts and professionals especially moving in different directions. I just hope that those who want to focus rightfully, no excuses or no apologies necessary, rather, aren't interested in harvest, but are more interested in conservation biology, realize that hunting and harvesting, they're some of your best allies. They have carried the bucket of water for many years. You can thank that Pittman Robertson and that group, that philosophy, that group of people that put their money where their mouth is for getting us at least as far as we have. Last thing I'd say is I apologize for all the atrocities my generation may have left all of you to solve, but I think you're smart and hardworking. I think you'll get it done.
Any final questions?
I don't have anything more to say. Thanks all for your patience. If you're like me, you have to think a while. I'll hang around for a few minutes if you have any questions that you can't think of right now.
David, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
service, your career, for being here, and for putting up with a lot of us that work for you.
No, it's been a blast.
Okay.